There's a particular kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. You can be surrounded by people who love you, sitting in the middle of a good conversation, laughing at the right moments, nodding at the right places, and still feel it. This quiet, unbridgeable distance between what you're actually experiencing and what everyone around you seems to be experiencing. Like you've started speaking a language no one else in the room knows, and there's no one left to translate for. If you know that feeling, then you already understand what this whole thing is about, even before I explain it. And if you don't, no amount of explaining will fully get you there. That's not me being cryptic, that's the entire point. Because what spiritually awakened people share isn't a belief, or an opinion, or a set of ideas you can be argued into. It's a perception. And a perception can't be handed to someone the way you hand over a fact. Carl Jung spent the back half of his life circling this exact problem. He noticed that certain people arrived at his door carrying something they couldn't name and couldn't communicate. They'd try to describe what had happened to them, a shift in how they saw everything, a sudden inability to take seriously the things that used to run their lives. And the words would come out sounding like madness, or like nothing at all. The experience was real. It was often the most real thing that had ever happened to them. But it lived in a place that language couldn't reach. Jung understood this because it had happened to him. And what he eventually concluded was that consciousness itself has thresholds, doors you walk through. And once you've walked through one, you can describe the room you're standing in all you want. But the people still on the other side of the door will only ever hear a voice muffled through the wall. They can hear that you're saying something, they just can't make out the words. Today I want to walk you through what Jung discovered about this threshold, the specific perceptual shift that separates awakened people from everyone else, why it isolates you so completely even from people you're close to, why almost everyone around you will interpret it as a problem to be fixed, and what happens if you stop trying to translate it and start living inside it instead. Because the thing only spiritually awakened people understand isn't a secret they're keeping. It's a country they've moved to, and you can't send a postcard that contains the actual place. Let me start with what the shift actually is, because most descriptions of spiritual awakening get this wrong from the first sentence. They make it sound like an addition, like you acquire something, peace, insight, higher vibrations, whatever the marketing language happens to be that season. As if awakening is a new feature installed on top of the same old machine. What Jung observed was closer to a subtraction. Awakening is what's left when a particular illusion falls away. And the illusion that falls is the most fundamental one a human being carries. The belief that the world you perceive is simply the world, that the story you're living inside is just reality, plainly and obviously there, the same for everyone. Here's what he meant. Every person is born into a set of assumptions so deep they never register as assumptions. Your family's emotional rules, your culture's definition of success, what's worth wanting, what counts as a good life, a wasted life, a shameful one, the meaning of money, of status, of other people's approval. You don't choose these things. They're poured into you before you have the language to question them, and they harden into what feels like the plain shape of reality. Jung would say you're not living your life. You're living the collective's life through you and calling it your own. The awakened person is simply someone in whom this arrangement broke. Something happened, a loss, a crisis, a slow erosion, sometimes nothing external at all, and for a moment, the water became visible. They saw the story as a story. They saw that the thing everyone treats as solid, absolute, obviously real ground is actually a set of agreements. A shared dream that most people never wake up from because there's no reason to, and every reason not to. And once you've seen that, you can't unsee it. That's the part nobody warns you about. You don't get to notice that everyone's running someone else's software and then go back to running it comfortably yourself. The recognition is permanent. You now live in a world where you can watch the invisible structure operating in real time, in conversations, in the news, in your family's expectations, in the ambitions you spent years chasing, and you can't turn the seeing off. This is why awakened people so often describe feeling like they're behind glass, present at the party but observing it, in the meeting but watching the whole performance rather than believing in it. It looks from the outside like detachment, like they've checked out, gone cold, stopped caring. What's really happening is that they've stopped being fully hypnotized. And a person who's no longer fully hypnotized cannot pretend they still are, no matter how much easier that would make everyone's life. Jung had a name for the long process this belongs to. He called it individuation. And it's worth being clear about what he meant, because the word gets thrown around loosely. Individuation isn't self-improvement. It isn't becoming a better version of the person you already were. It's the slow, often disorienting process of separating out who you actually are from everything you absorbed, inherited, and performed. It's becoming an individual in the literal sense, undivided, whole, no longer just a node in the collective mind, but a distinct center of consciousness that knows itself as distinct. And here's the trap built into it. To become an individual in that sense, you have to psychologically leave the group. Not physically necessarily, but inwardly, you have to withdraw your belief from the shared dream. And the group can feel that withdrawal even when you say nothing. Something in them registers that you're no longer fully theirs, no longer reflecting their reality back to them, no longer confirming that the water is just the way things are. And most groups, most families, most relationships built on the old agreements will experience your awakening not as growth, but as betrayal. That's the first hard truth only awakened people understand. That becoming more conscious does not make you more connected to the people around you, at least not at first. It makes you, for a long and lonely stretch, far more alone. Because you now perceive a dimension of reality that the people you love are still sleeping through, and there is no sentence you can construct that will wake them before they're ready. Let me slow down on that because it's the exact place where this becomes real rather than abstract. Picture what actually happens when you try to share it. You're at dinner with someone you've known for years, and you try, tentatively, to describe the thing. How you've started to see that most of what people chase is a kind of managed distraction. How the goals everyone's grinding toward look increasingly like elaborate ways to avoid sitting still with themselves. You're not trying to be superior, you're trying to be honest. You're reaching across the table with both hands, hoping they'll take what you're offering. And you watch their face do something specific. A slight flattening, a polite retreat. Maybe a joke to change the subject, or a gentle diagnosis. You've been reading too much, you're going through a phase, you should probably talk to someone. And you realize in that moment that the words came out of your mouth and died somewhere in the air between you. They landed as nonsense, or as arrogance, or as a symptom. The thing you were trying to give them simply did not survive the crossing. Jung saw this constantly. He noticed that people undergoing genuine transformation were almost always misread by those closest to them. And he understood why. It wasn't cruelty. It was that the persona, the social mask each of us wears, the acceptable, legible version of ourselves we present to the world, is what relationships are usually built on. People don't fall in love with each other. They fall in love with each other's personas, the polished performance, the reliable role. And when one person starts dismantling their persona because it's become unbearable to keep performing, the other person experiences it as the ground shifting. The person they knew is disappearing. and they'll do almost anything to get them back. So they push, they worry, they pathologize, they tell you you've changed, and they don't mean it as an observation, they mean it as an accusation. Because your change is costing them the comfortable reality you used to help maintain. When you were performing the agreed-upon version of yourself, you were holding up your corner of the shared dream. Now you've let go of it, and they can feel the whole structure wobble. And here's the part that makes it almost unbearable. You can't even be angry at them, because they're not wrong to be frightened. Something is dying. The relationship as it existed really is ending, at least in its old form. You've simply stopped being able to lie, and to a relationship built on comfortable, unspoken lies, honesty registers as attack. This is the loneliness of consciousness, and Jung was unflinching about it. He wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, but he never pretended that privilege came free. The cost is exactly this. You see more, and seeing more separates you from those who see less, and there is no way to give them your eyes. He knew this from the inside. Around 1913, Jung entered a period of his life so destabilizing that for years he genuinely wondered whether he was going insane. His inner world had cracked open, and material was pouring through that he couldn't explain to his colleagues, couldn't fit into the respectable psychiatry of his day, couldn't share with almost anyone without sounding like a man coming apart. He was one of the most respected minds in Europe, and he was walking around carrying an experience he couldn't communicate to a single living person in a way they'd truly understand. What he did with that isolation is the whole story, and we'll get there. But first I want to sit for a moment in how disorienting that gap is, because if you're in it right now, you need to hear that the disorientation is not a malfunction. You start to distrust yourself. That's what the isolation does over time. When every attempt to share your inner reality gets met with confusion or concern, a quiet suspicion builds. Maybe they're right. Maybe you are just losing perspective. Maybe the thing you saw so clearly was a distortion, and everyone else, in their agreement, in their certainty, is the sane one. The pressure of consensus is enormous. When every voice around you insists the water isn't there, it takes a strange and stubborn kind of courage to keep trusting that you saw it. And this is precisely where most people turn back. Not because the awakening wasn't real, because the loneliness of it became more than they could carry, and the pull to return to the warm, agreed-upon reality, to re-enter the dream, to put the mask back on, to say the words that make everyone relax, became overwhelming. Jung watched people do this. He'd see someone standing at the very edge of becoming themselves, and then the fear would win, and they'd retreat back into the collective. They'd recommit to the life that had been suffocating them. They'd rebuild the persona and start performing again. And from the outside, it would look like they'd recovered, come back to their senses, gotten their feet back under them. But Jung understood what had actually happened. They'd chosen the comfort of the shared sleep over the loneliness of being awake. And they'd carry, for the rest of their lives, a low background ache, the sense of a self they'd met once and then abandoned. If you're somewhere in the middle of this right now, if you've seen something you can't unsee and you're not sure whether you're waking up or breaking down, and there's no one in your life who seems able to tell you the difference, I want to mention something we put together for exactly this stretch of the road. It's a guide called True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises built directly from Jung's approach to individuation. Not to pull you out of the disorientation, but to help you stay in it honestly. To give you a way of listening to what's actually happening in you instead of drowning it out with everyone else's certainty. The link is just below. But stay with me, because the most important part of this is still ahead. What happens if you don't turn back? Because here's what Jung discovered on the other side of his own long isolation, and it changes the meaning of everything I've described so far. The loneliness of awakening is real, but it's not the destination. it's the passage. And the people who could tolerate it, who could stay in the gap without either retreating to the old sleep or forcing a fake resolution, came out somewhere the sleeping never reach. Let me explain what that looks like, because it's more specific and stranger than most people expect. The first thing that shifts is your relationship to being understood. In the early stage of awakening, the isolation is agonizing precisely because you still desperately want to be understood. You keep reaching across the table. You keep trying to translate. Every failed attempt lands like a small rejection, and you keep attempting it anyway, because the need for someone to see what you see feels like survival. What changes, slowly, is that the need itself begins to dissolve. Not because you've given up on connection, but because you stop requiring other people to validate your perception before you'll trust it. Jung would frame this as a shift in the center of gravity of the personality, a move away from what he called the ego, the anxious little manager that needs constant external confirmation, toward what he called the self, the deeper center that knows what it knows regardless of whether anyone else confirms it. This is subtle, but it's everything. When your sense of reality no longer depends on other people agreeing with it, the loneliness undergoes a transformation. It's still solitude, but it stops being a wound. You can be the only person in the room who sees a certain thing and feel no need to convince anyone, no ache of rejection, no desperate reaching. You've stopped trying to teach people a language they're not ready to learn, and in stopping, you've laid down an enormous weight you didn't know you were carrying. The second shift is even harder to describe, which is fitting, since the difficulty of describing it is the whole subject. Jung called it, in his study of alchemy and Eastern thought, an intuition of the unus mundus, the one world. The felt sense that beneath the apparent separateness of everything, there's a single, connected fabric, that your inner life and the outer world aren't two different things, but two faces of one thing. This is where the experience Jung called synchronicity comes in. Meaningful coincidences that arrive too precisely to be random. You think of someone and they appear. You're wrestling with a question and the answer walks up to you in a stranger's offhand comment, repeating patterns, timing that seems almost authored. To the sleeping mind, this is superstition, apophenia, the brain seeing faces in clouds. And you'll never convince the sleeping mind otherwise, so don't try. But the awakened person experiences it differently. And here's the thing they understand that can't be explained. They experience reality as responsive, as if the universe is not a dead mechanism they're bouncing around inside, but something more like a field that's somehow in dialogue with their own depths. Jung was a scientist. He didn't say this lightly, and he took decades to say it at all. But he came to believe that at a certain level of consciousness, the line between inner and outer thins, and life begins to arrange itself in ways that carry meaning. Not meaning you impose, meaning you receive. You cannot argue anyone into this. That's the recurring wall. You can only ever say, once you've experienced reality as responsive, the idea that it's a cold accident stops being believable. Not because you've disproven it, but because you're now living in a different room. And the people in the other room will always be able to explain your room away. Let them. Their explanations are perfectly logical. They're just describing a country they've never visited. The third shift is the one that finally resolves the isolation, and it's the least expected. Jung noticed that fully individuated people, the ones who'd gone all the way through, didn't end up cold, aloof, floating above humanity in some enlightened bubble. The opposite. They came back down. They became capable of a kind of connection the sleeping can't access, precisely because they were no longer connecting through the persona. Think about what most relationships actually are. Two masks agreeing to get along. Two performances negotiating. The awakened person can't do that anymore, and for a long time that inability isolates them. But eventually, it becomes their greatest gift. Because when you've stopped performing, you become able to meet another person at the level beneath the performance. And when you meet someone else who's also stopped performing, even briefly, even a stranger, the connection is instant and total in a way that the mask-to-mask version never was. Jung understood that only individuated people can truly relate, because only they are actually present as themselves rather than as a role. The loneliness of the middle passage was never the truth about awakening. It was the withdrawal symptom of leaving the false connection before the real connection had formed. You had to lose the crowd to find the few. You had to become no one's reflection before you could become someone's genuine mirror. And this reframes the entire journey. The distance you feel from people right now, the glass, the muffled voices, the sense of speaking an untranslatable language. Jung would tell you it's not a sign you've gone wrong. It's a sign you're between two ways of connecting. The old way, through the mask, is dying. The new way, through the truth, hasn't fully arrived, and the gap between them feels like isolation only because you don't yet have the new relationships that the new you can actually hold. There's a marker of genuine awakening that Jung considered more reliable than almost any other, and I want to name it because it separates the real thing from the counterfeit. The counterfeit version of awakening makes you feel superior. It hands you a new identity. I'm awake, they're asleep, I see, they're blind. And that identity becomes a fresh mask, sometimes the most inflated one of all. Jung called this ego inflation, the ego dressing up in the clothing of the self and mistaking itself for something vast. The real thing goes the other direction. It humbles you. Because the further you go, the more you become aware of how much you were sleeping, how long you performed without knowing it, how much you still don't see. Genuinely awakened people don't announce their awakening or judge the sleeping for being asleep. They remember too clearly what it was to sleep. They know consciousness isn't a trophy someone earns and then owns. It's a threshold you keep crossing again and again, in smaller and larger ways for the rest of your life. So if part of what you feel is impatience with everyone still lost in the dream, a subtle contempt, a tiredness with how blind people are, Jung would gently push back on that. That impatience is a sign the ego has hijacked the awakening and turned it into status. The truly awakened person feels something closer to tenderness for the sleeping, because they understand that the sleep isn't stupidity, it's protection. People stay in the dream because the dream is holding something together that they're not yet strong enough to hold consciously. Their sleep is doing them a service, exactly as yours once did for you. This is worth sitting with if you've been quietly frustrated that no one around you gets it. Their not getting it isn't a failure of intelligence, it's timing. The threshold opens for each person on its own schedule, usually pried open by a suffering that hasn't yet arrived for them, or a suffering they're not yet done avoiding. You crossed because life pressed on you in exactly the way and at exactly the moment that broke the illusion. Theirs hasn't come, or has come and hasn't finished its work. You can't rush it. You can only keep the door visible by being what you are, so that when their moment comes, they might remember they once knew someone who'd walked through. And that, quietly, is the answer to the isolation. You stop trying to drag people across the threshold, and you become instead a kind of evidence that the other side exists. You live differently. You want different things. You're harder to manipulate, less impressed by the games, more at ease in silence, less desperate for the approval everyone else is bleeding themselves dry to earn. People will feel that even when they can't name it. Some will be threatened by it, and they'll pull away, and that's the cost. But a few will be drawn toward it. They'll sense that you have something they're beginning to hunger for, and without a single word of explanation, your existence will crack their door open a little wider. Jung believed this was the actual function of the awakened individual within the collective. Not to preach, not to convert, just to be a point of consciousness in a mostly sleeping world, and by being that, to make a little more consciousness available to everyone. He thought the whole species was slowly, painfully individuating, and that each person who went through the passage added something to the sum of what humanity could become. Your loneliness, in that light, isn't purposeless. It's a kind of pioneering. You're standing on ground that will one day be common, so that others can stand there after you. Let me come back to where we started because it looks completely different now. That loneliness you can feel in a crowded room, the sense of speaking a language no one around you knows. I described it at the beginning as the thing that only awakened people understand, and it is. But I framed it as a wound, because that's how it feels when you're inside the early passage of it. Here's the fuller truth. That loneliness is the feeling of a self that has become too large to be contained by the collective story. It's not smallness, it's an overflow. You're not lonely because something is wrong with you. You're lonely because something in you has grown past the dimensions of the shared dream, and the dream has no room for what you're becoming. And so for a while, you stand at its edge, half in and half out, mourning the warmth of the sleep even as you feel yourself unable to return to it. And the thing that makes you feel most alone, that no one can understand what you're seeing, is the same thing that means you've actually become an individual, in the deepest sense Jung ever meant that word, a person whose consciousness is genuinely their own. The very fact that it can't be transmitted is the proof that it's real. If it could be handed over like a fact, it would be a fact, and facts don't wake anyone up. Only the threshold does, and the threshold has to be crossed alone, which is the one thing no one can tell you in advance, and the one thing every awakened person eventually understands in their bones. So you won't be understood, not fully, not for a while, maybe not by the people you most wish would understand. That's real, and there's no point pretending otherwise. But you will, eventually, stop needing to be. And on the far side of that need, you'll find the few who speak the language after all, not because you taught it to them, but because they crossed their own threshold and arrived, quietly, in the same country. And when you meet them, no translation will be necessary. You'll recognize each other the way two people recognize their finally, mercifully, home. If any of this has landed in that wordless place where you already knew it before I said it, then you're further along than the loneliness has been telling you. And if you want a way to keep walking it, to make sense of the passage from the inside while you're still in it, that guide I mentioned, True Self-Discovery, was built for exactly this. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's work on individuation, made not to give you easy answers, but to help you keep trusting the thing you've seen when everyone around you insists it isn't there. It's a way of keeping yourself company through the crossing. You'll find it linked just below.